The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. 8 F-18 Super Hornets were returning from a classified mission over the Pacific when their nightmare began. Engine failures, fuel leaks, and electrical malfunctions hit the squadron simultaneously. The lead pilot's voice cut through the static. "Mayday, mayday. Peterson Tower. Crimson Squadron requesting immediate emergency landing. We have multiple aircraft in distress. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." What happened next would shake the foundations of military protocol and reveal a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for over a decade. The person who would save 8 of America's finest pilots wasn't a seasoned air traffic controller, an experienced pilot, or a high-ranking officer. It was Eleanor Blackwood, the night shift janitor who had been silently mopping floors and emptying trash cans while harboring one of the most extraordinary backgrounds in aviation history. ELLENOR. Blackwood had been cleaning the floors of Peterson Air Force Base's control tower for 11 years. Every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., she pushed her cart through the sterile corridors, her footsteps echoing in the darkness while the skeleton crew of air traffic controllers managed the quiet overnight operations. She was practically invisible to most of the personnel, just another face in the crowd of civilian contractors who kept the base running. At 52 years old, Eleanor had the kind of unassuming presence that made people look right through her. Average height, graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the standard issue custodial uniform of navy blue pants and a matching polo shirt. She carried herself with quiet efficiency, never drawing attention, never causing problems. The perfect employee who showed up on time, did her job, and went home without fanfare. But Eleanor Blackwood was not who she appeared to be. 3 years earlier, Captain Eleanor Mitchell had been one of the youngest pilots ever to graduate from the Air Force Academy. She had accumulated over 3,000 flight hours in everything from F-16 Fighting Falcons to massive C-130 Hercules transport planes. She held certifications in aerial refueling, formation flying, and had completed advanced training in emergency landing procedures that few pilots ever experienced. Her service record was exemplary, filled with commendations and recognition for her exceptional flying skills and cool-headed decision-making. Under pressure. Then came the incident that changed everything. During a routine training exercise over Nevada in 2001, Eleanor had been leading a formation of 4 F-16s when a catastrophic mechanical failure occurred in her wingman's aircraft. Lieutenant Sarah Chun's fighter had suffered a complete hydraulic system failure at 30,000 feet, leaving her with no control over the aircraft's primary flight surfaces. Standard protocol called for immediate ejection, but Chun was flying over a populated area near Las Vegas, and her trajectory would send the pilotless fighter directly into a residential neighborhood. Without hesitation, Eleanor had made a decision that violated every rule in the book. She positioned her own F-16 beneath Chun's failing aircraft and used her fighter as a guide, literally pushing Chun's plane with her own to redirect its flight path away from the civilian population below. The maneuver was impossible according to every flight manual ever written, yet Eleanor executed it flawlessly, saving hundreds of lives on the ground while allowing Chun to eject safely over an unpopulated desert area. The aftermath should have made Eleanor a hero. Instead, it ended her career. The investigation that followed focused not on the lives saved, but on the unauthorized maneuver that had put 2 aircraft and their pilots at risk. Military regulations were absolute, and Eleanor had broken them. Regardless of the outcome, the review board acknowledged her exceptional skill and noble intentions, but rules were rules. She was given an honorable discharge with full benefits, but her flying days in the military were over. Eleanor had tried to transition to commercial aviation, But the mark on her military record made airlines hesitant to hire her. Flight schools weren't interested in instructors who had a history of breaking protocol, regardless of the circumstances. Slowly, inevitably, she found herself pushed out of the aviation world entirely. The only jobs available were ground-based positions that barely utilized a fraction of her expertise. She had taken the custodial job at Peterson Air Force Base, not out of necessity, but out of a deep longing to remain connected to the world of flight. Even if she couldn't pilot aircraft anymore, she could at least be near them. She could listen to the radio chatter, watch the takeoffs and landings, and remember what it felt like to slip the surly bonds of Earth and touch the face of the sky. For over a decade, Eleanor had maintained her pilot's license through private flight training on weekends. She couldn't afford anything fancy, usually renting small Cessna aircraft from the local airfield, but she kept her skills sharp. She studied every new aircraft manual she could get her hands on, stay in current with technological advances and procedural changes. Her small apartment was filled with aviation magazines, technical journals, and flight simulation software that she used to practice emergency scenarios that she hoped she'd never encounter again. The other custodial staff knew nothing of her background. To them, she was just Eleanor, the quiet woman who worked the night shift and never caused any trouble. She preferred it that way. The air traffic controllers who worked the overnight shift had grown accustomed to her presence, barely acknowledging her as she cleaned around their workstations. She had become part of the furniture, invisible and unremarkable. But Eleanor heard everything. Night after night, she listened to the radio communications between the tower and incoming and outgoing aircraft. She heard the routine traffic reports, the weather updates, the coordination between different flights. More importantly, she heard the problems. Equipment malfunctions, weather diversions, medical emergencies, fuel shortages. Over the years, she had developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the base's operations, flight patterns, and emergency procedures. She knew which runways were optimal for different wind conditions. She understood the radar coverage areas and dead zones. She was familiar with the emergency response protocols and the locations of crash and rescue equipment. In many ways, Eleanor knew Peterson Air Force Base's aviation operations better than some of the controllers who worked there. On the night of March 15th, Eleanor was following her usual routine. She had started her shift by emptying wastebaskets in the administrative offices, then moved on to mopping the floors in the main corridors. By 2:30 a.m., she had worked her way up to the control tower, where Senior Airman Marcus Rodriguez was handling the overnight air traffic control duties. Rodriguez was competent, but relatively inexperienced, having been stationed at Peterson for only 8 months. The overnight shift was typically quiet, with minimal traffic and routine operations. Most of the base's pilots were asleep, and civilian air traffic was light in the early morning hours. It was the kind of assignment that allowed controllers to ease into their responsibilities without the pressure of high-volume operations. Eleanor was cleaning the windows that overlooked the runway when the first emergency call came in. Peterson Tower, this is the Crimson Leader. We have an emergency situation. Requesting immediate priority landing for 8 aircraft. Rodriguez's voice was steady but concerned as he responded. Crimson Leader, Peterson Tower. State the nature of your emergency. Tower, we're experiencing multiple system failures across the squadron. We have engine problems, fuel leaks, and electrical malfunctions. We need to get these birds on the ground immediately. Eleanor froze, her cleaning cloth still in hand. She had heard thousands of radio communications over the years, but something in the lead pilot's voice told her this was different. This wasn't a routine mechanical issue or a precautionary landing. This was a genuine emergency involving multiple aircraft. Rodriguez was doing his job by the book, but Eleanor could hear the uncertainty in his responses. He was following standard protocols, But 8 aircraft in simultaneous distress was not a standard situation. The controller began coordinating with emergency services, alerting fire and rescue crews, and clearing other traffic from the area. But as the communications continued, it became clear that the situation was far more complex than anyone had initially realized. The weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. A massive storm system was moving in from the west, bringing high winds, heavy precipitation, and dangerous wind shear conditions. The base's primary runway was already reporting crosswinds approaching the maximum limits for safe landings, and conditions were expected to worsen over the next hour. Worse yet, the squadron's problems were escalating. 2 of the F-18s were reporting critical fuel levels that would make it impossible to divert to alternate airfields. Another aircraft had suffered a complete electrical failure, leaving the pilot flying on backup instruments in the pre-dawn darkness. The lead pilot's voice remained professional, but Eleanor could detect the growing tension as their options narrowed. Rodriguez was doing everything right, following emergency protocols and coordinating with all the appropriate agencies. But Eleanor could see something that the young controller couldn't. The situation was rapidly approaching the limits of standard procedures. The combination of multiple aircraft emergencies, deteriorating weather conditions, and time pressure was creating a scenario that required more than textbook responses. As she continued to listen to the radio traffic, Eleanor found herself mentally calculating approach vectors, fuel consumption rates, and landing sequences. Her mind automatically began working through the complex logistics of getting 8 distressed aircraft safely on the ground under increasingly dangerous conditions. She tried to focus on her cleaning duties, telling herself that it wasn't her problem and that Rodriguez was perfectly capable of handling the situation. But 23 years of aviation experience couldn't be turned off like a switch. Every instinct she had developed as a pilot was screaming that this emergency was about to exceed the capabilities of standard air traffic control procedures. The first sign of real trouble came when Rodriguez began having difficulty establishing reliable communication with 3 of the F-18s. The electrical problems that had started as minor malfunctions were cascading into complete communication failures. The lead pilot was having to relay messages between the tower and his wingmen, adding critical delays to an already time-sensitive situation. Then the weather took another turn for the worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader. We're encountering severe turbulence and wind shear. At our current altitude, we need to begin our approach immediately, or we're going to lose more aircraft. Rodriguez's response came quickly. Crimson Leader, be advised that ground winds are now gusting to 45 knots with variable direction. Recommend holding pattern until conditions improve. Negative Tower, we don't have the fuel for a holding pattern. We're coming in now. Eleanor set down her cleaning supplies and moved closer to the radio console. She could see the radar screen, showing the 8 aircraft approaching from the southwest. Their formation spread wider than normal due to various mechanical problems each plane was experiencing. The weather radar was painting an ominous picture of the storm system that was bearing down on the base. This was the moment when everything changed. Rodriguez was following protocol by recommending a holding pattern, but the fuel situation made that impossible. The pilots needed to land immediately, but the weather conditions were approaching the point where even experienced pilots would struggle to maintain control during landing. The combination of crosswinds, wind shear, and reduced visibility was creating a perfect storm of aviation hazards. Eleanor watched as Rodriguez coordinated with the meteorology unit, trying to get updated weather information that might reveal a brief window of improved conditions. She could see him consulting his emergency procedures manual, double-checking protocols for multiple aircraft emergencies. He was doing everything by the book, but the book hadn't been written for this specific combination of circumstances. Young Controller's professionalism was admirable, but Eleanor could see that he was approaching the edge of his experience and training. The situation was evolving faster than standard procedures could accommodate, and soon it would require the kind of split-second decision-making that only came from years of hands-on aviation experience. As she stood in the shadows of the control tower, Eleanor Blackwood faced a choice that would change everything. She could remain invisible, the quiet janitor who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans, watching as events unfolded beyond her control. Or she could step forward and reveal the secret she had kept hidden for over a decade. 8 F-18 Super Hornets were approaching through dangerous weather with multiple system failures and critically low fuel levels. In a few minutes, their fate would be decided by split-second decisions and expert judgment. The question was, who was qualified to make those decisions when standard procedures were no longer adequate? The radio crackled again with increasing urgency in the lead pilot's voice. "Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader. We're beginning our final approach. Weather conditions are critical, and we're running out of options." At that moment, Eleanor Blackwood realized that her decade of hiding was about to come to an end. The radar screen showed 8 blips descending through 15,000 feet, each one representing a multi-million-dollar fighter jet and the life of a highly trained pilot. Rodriguez's hands moved across his control panel with practiced efficiency, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the tower. "Crimson 2, Peterson Tower, please confirm your fuel status," Rodriguez transmitted. "Static." Filled the radio for several seconds before a strained voice responded. "Tower, Crimson 2. We're showing approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption. We need to be on the ground in the next 8 minutes or we're going to have a problem." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. 12 minutes of fuel with an 8-minute window meant there was virtually no margin for error. If the landing approach had to be aborted due to weather conditions, Crimson 2 wouldn't have enough fuel for a second attempt. The pilot would be forced to eject, and the aircraft would be lost. Rodriguez was coordinating with multiple agencies simultaneously. His radio chatter was constant as he communicated with the approaching squadron, ground emergency services, meteorology, and base operations. But Eleanor could see that the young controller was beginning to show signs of stress overload. His responses were taking slightly longer, and he was having to repeat some transmissions. "Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader. We're encountering severe downdrafts at 12,000 feet. Aircraft are being separated by turbulence. We may not be able to maintain the formation approach." This was exactly what Eleanor had been afraid of. The F-18s were designed to operate as a coordinated unit, but the weather was forcing them apart. Without formation discipline, the approach sequence would become exponentially more complex. Each aircraft would need individual guidance and sequencing, multiplying the controller's workload at the worst possible moment. Rodriguez keyed his microphone. "Crimson Leader, Peterson Tower. Understand formation breakup. Please advise when ready to begin individual approach sequences." "Negative, Tower. We need to bring these birds in as a group. Individual approaches will take too long with our fuel." Situation. Eleanor stepped closer to the radar console. She could see the squadron's position relative to the airfield, and her experienced eye immediately identified the problem that Rodriguez hadn't yet recognized. The current approach vector would bring the aircraft directly through the worst part of the storm system. The pilots were trying to maintain formation through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. She watched as one of the radar blips began to diverge from the group. Crimson 6 was falling behind, likely due to engine problems that were worsening under the stress of fighting turbulent air. The pilot was pushing his damaged aircraft to its limits just to keep up with the squadron. "Tower, Crimson 6. I'm losing power on my number 2 engine. I'm going to fall back from the formation." Rodriguez immediately responded. Crimson 6, Peterson Tower. Roger, your engine problem. Do you need priority handling? Negative, Tower. I can maintain controlled flight, but I won't be able to keep up with the squadron's approach speed. Now Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. He could prioritize Crimson 6 due to the engine failure, but that would mean breaking up the formation and potentially leaving the other aircraft without enough fuel for individual approaches. Or he could maintain the group approach and risk having Crimson 6 fall so far behind that the pilot would be forced to attempt a solo landing in deteriorating weather conditions. Eleanor found herself mentally calculating approach speeds, fuel burn rates, and timing sequences. Her mind was automatically working through the complex three-dimensional puzzle of getting multiple aircraft safely on the ground. She could see solutions that weren't apparent from Rodriguez's perspective, but she remained silent, fighting every instinct that told her to speak up. The weather radar showed the storm intensifying. Wind speeds were increasing, and the precipitation was becoming heavier. The window for safe landing operations was closing rapidly. In another 15 minutes, conditions would deteriorate to the point where even emergency landings would be prohibitively dangerous. Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader. We're beginning our final approach. Winds are variable and visibility is decreasing. We need guidance on the optimal approach vector. Rodriguez consulted his weather data and began providing standard approach instructions. But Eleanor could see that the information he was working with was already outdated. Weather conditions were changing faster than the meteorological equipment could track, and the prescribed approach path would take the squadron directly through a wind shear zone that had developed in the last few minutes. She watched in growing alarm as the 8 aircraft began their descent toward the runway. The radar showed them struggling to maintain consistent spacing as they battled the turbulent air. One aircraft was already deviating significantly from the prescribed glide path, and 2 others were having difficulty maintaining proper approach speed. Then disaster struck. Mayday, mayday! Crimson 4 is in an uncontrolled descent. We've lost hydraulics and primary flight controls. Rodriguez's voice remained steady despite the crisis. Crimson 4, Peterson Tower. Roger, your mayday. Emergency services are standing by. Can you maintain controlled flight? Negative, Tower. The aircraft is not responding to inputs. I'm going to have to punch out. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Ejection at this altitude and in these weather conditions was extremely dangerous. The pilot would be descending through violent turbulence and darkness, with high winds that could carry the parachute far from the intended landing zone, ground. Rescue teams would have difficulty locating the pilot in the storm conditions, but there was an even more immediate problem. If Crimson 4's pilot ejected, the pilotless fighter would continue its uncontrolled descent toward the ground. The aircraft's trajectory could potentially interfere with the approach paths of the other 7 F-18s, creating a collision hazard. That would turn one emergency into a catastrophic disaster. Rodriguez was handling the situation professionally, but Eleanor could see that he was approaching the limits of what a single controller could manage. He was simultaneously coordinating the emergency response for Crimson 4's potential ejection while trying to guide the remaining 7 aircraft through increasingly dangerous weather conditions. Crimson Leader, be advised that Crimson 4 may be ejecting on your approach path. You may need to execute missed approach procedures. Tower, Crimson Leader. We don't have fuel for a missed approach. We need to get these aircraft on the ground now. The situation had reached a critical decision point. 7 F-18s were committed to landing with barely enough fuel to complete their approach, while an 8th aircraft was in uncontrolled flight. Somewhere in their vicinity, the weather was continuing to deteriorate, and standard air traffic control procedures were proving inadequate for the complexity of the emergency. Eleanor made her decision. She stepped forward from the shadows and approached Rodriguez's workstation. The young controller was focused intently on his radar screen and radio communications, and didn't immediately notice her presence. "Excuse me," Eleanor said quietly. Rodriguez glanced up, surprised to see the night janitor standing beside his console during the middle of an emergency. "Ma'am, I need you to stay back. We're handling a critical situation here." "I know," Eleanor replied, "and I think I can help." Rodriguez looked at her with confusion and growing irritation. The last thing he needed during a complex emergency was interference from civilian personnel. "Ma'am, please step away from the control area. I don't have time for Crimson 4's aircraft is going to impact the ground approximately 2 miles northeast of the runway threshold." Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm and professional. "Based on its current trajectory and descent rate, the wreckage will not interfere with the approach path for the remaining aircraft. You can continue with the group landing sequence." Rodriguez stared at her in shock. How could a janitor possibly know aircraft trajectory calculations and approach path analysis? But before he could respond, Eleanor continued. "The real problem is the wind shear layer at 800 feet. Your current approach vector will take the squadron directly through it. You need to adjust their glide path to approach from the southeast instead of southwest. It will add 90 seconds to their approach time, but 3 of those aircraft don't have fuel margins for wind shear recovery." Rodriguez's mouth fell open. The technical accuracy of her observations was impossible to ignore. But he couldn't understand how a civilian custodial worker could possess such detailed knowledge of aviation procedures. "Who are you?" he asked. "Right now, I'm someone who can help you save 7 pilots," Eleanor replied. "But we don't have time for explanations. Crimson Leader is 30 seconds away from entering that wind shear zone, and once he's committed to the current approach path, it will be too late to change course." The radio crackled with increasing urgency. "Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader, we're encountering severe downdrafts. Aircraft are having difficulty maintaining glide path." Rodriguez looked at Eleanor, then at his radar screen, then back at Eleanor. Training and regulations told him to maintain control of the situation and not accept assistance from unauthorized personnel. But the evidence of his own eyes and ears told him that this woman possessed knowledge and expertise that could be crucial to resolving the emergency. "What do you recommend?" he asked. Eleanor moved closer to the radar console. "Vector them to a right turn, heading 140 degrees. Have them descend to 2,000 feet and establish a wide approach pattern from the southeast. The wind conditions are more stable from that direction, and it will give the trailing aircraft more time to resolve their mechanical problems." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then keyed his microphone. "Crimson Leader, Peterson Tower. Execute immediate right turn to heading 140 degrees. Descend and maintain 2,000 feet. We're vectoring you for southeast approach to runway 35. Tower. Crimson Leader. Confirm right turn 140 degrees. Descend to 2,000. That's going to add time to our approach. We're already critical on fuel. Crimson Leader, trust me on this one. The new approach path will be more stable and give you better conditions for landing." Eleanor watched the radar screen as the 7 remaining F-18s began their turn to the new heading. The maneuver spread them out slightly, which would actually make the approach sequence safer by giving each aircraft more separation during the critical final approach phase. "Crimson 4, Peterson Tower. What's your status?" The radio remained silent for several seconds before a different voice responded. "Tower, this is Crimson Leader. Crimson 4 successfully ejected at 3,000 feet. We observed a good chute deployment. The pilot should be down in the area of Highway 94, approximately 3 miles northeast of the base." Rodriguez immediately coordinated with ground rescue teams to begin searching for the downed pilot. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to monitor the approach of the remaining 7 aircraft. "The southeast approach is working," she observed. "Wind Conditions are much more stable from that direction. But you're going to need to sequence the landings carefully. Crimson 2 and Crimson 6 are both showing signs of fuel emergency, and Crimson 7 has been reporting intermittent electrical problems. Rodriguez looked at her with growing amazement. How do you know all this? I've been listening to their radio transmissions for the past 40 minutes, Elena replied. Crimson 2 reported 12 minutes of fuel 38 minutes ago. Crimson 6 has been gradually losing power on his number 2 engine, which means his fuel consumption is higher than normal. And Crimson 7 has had 3 separate electrical malfunctions that are probably related to water intrusion in his avionics bay. The young controller realized that this woman had been tracking the emergency situation with the same attention to detail as a seasoned air traffic controller. But her analysis went beyond what he had been able to process while managing multiple radio frequencies and coordination requirements. Crimson 2, Peterson Tower. You're cleared for the straight-in approach to runway 35. Emergency services are standing by. Tower, Crimson 2. Roger, cleared for approach. Be advised we're showing less than 4 minutes of fuel remaining. Elena stepped closer to Rodriguez's position. He's not going to make it with a standard approach profile. You need to have him configured for a straight-in power-off approach. Cut his engines at 2 miles out and glide to the runway. It's his only chance. Rodriguez had never heard of such a procedure, but the urgency in Elena's voice convinced him that she knew what she was talking about. Crimson 2, Tower. When you reach 2 miles from the runway threshold, shut down both engines and configure for power-off approach. You'll be gliding to the runway. Tower, Crimson 2. Did you say power-off approach? I've never practiced that procedure in an F-18. Elena took the microphone from Rodriguez's hand. The young controller was too surprised to object. Crimson 2, this is Peterson Tower. The power-off approach is your best option for fuel conservation. Maintain 180 knots until 1 mile final, then configure landing gear and flaps. You'll have a steep descent rate, but the runway is long enough for rollout. Trust your training and fly the aircraft all the way to the ground. Tower, who is this? You're not Rodriguez. Crimson 2, this is someone who knows how to fly. Execute the power-off approach as instructed. You can do this. The radio was silent for several seconds. Then, Tower, Crimson 2. Roger, power off. Approach. Shutting down engines at 2 miles final. Rodriguez stared at Elena in complete bewilderment. She had just taken control of his radio frequency and provided flight instruction to a military pilot using procedures that weren't in any manual he had ever seen. Who are you? He asked again, but before Elena could answer, the next crisis began to unfold. Crimson 7's electrical problems had cascaded into a complete avionics failure, leaving the pilot flying on backup instruments in stormy weather conditions. The aircraft was now approaching the airfield with no radio communication, no radar transponder, and no electronic landing aids. Elena looked at the radar screen and saw a blip that was following an erratic flight path toward the runway. That's Crimson 7. He's lost his electronics and he's flying manually. He can't hear your radio transmissions, and he doesn't know about the approach sequence for the other aircraft. The situation was rapidly becoming unmanageable. 6 F-18s were in various stages of approach to the runway, with different fuel levels and mechanical problems, while a 7th aircraft was approaching without radio communication. The potential for mid-air collision or runway incursion was increasing with every passing minute. Elena realized that standard air traffic control procedures were no longer adequate for this situation. What was needed now was the kind of three-dimensional, tactical thinking that came from years of flying experience and split-second decision-making under pressure. She looked at Rodriguez and made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. I need you to trust me, she said. I can get these aircraft safely on the ground, but I'm going to have to do things that aren't in your procedures manual. Rodriguez looked at her, then at the radar screen showing 7 aircraft converging on his airfield in dangerous weather conditions. The complexity of the situation had exceeded his training and experience, but this mysterious woman seemed to understand exactly what needed to be done. "What do you need?" he asked. "I need you to let me take control of this frequency and coordinate these landings, and when this is over, I'll explain everything." Rodriguez handed her the microphone and stepped back from the console. For the first time in 11 years, Eleanor Blackwood was back in control of aircraft operations. Eleanor's hands moved across the control panel with the muscle memory of someone who had spent thousands of hours managing complex aviation operations. Her fingers found the frequency controls, radar adjustments, and communication switches with an instinctive familiarity that amazed Rodriguez. This was not a janitor fumbling with unfamiliar equipment. This was a professional returning to her element. "Crimson Leader, this is Peterson Tower with a new controller. I need immediate status reports from all aircraft, starting with fuel levels and mechanical problems." The lead pilot's voice came back with barely concealed frustration. "Tower, we don't have time for status reports. We need to get these aircraft on the ground immediately." "Crimson Leader, I understand your urgency, but I need current information to sequence your landing safely. 30 seconds now will save you 5 minutes on approach. Report fuel and status." Something in Eleanor's tone conveyed both authority and competence. The lead pilot's response was more cooperative. "Tower, Crimson Leader. 8 minutes of fuel remaining, all systems operational. Crimson 3 has 6 minutes fuel, minor hydraulic leak. Crimson 5 has 10 minutes fuel, electrical intermittent. Crimson 6 has 5 minutes of fuel, one engine producing reduced power. Crimson 7 no communication, unknown status. Crimson 8 12 minutes fuel, all systems operational." Eleanor quickly processed the information while studying the radar display. 6 aircraft with varying fuel levels and mechanical problems, plus 1 uncontrolled aircraft approaching without radio contact. The sequencing would have to be perfect, with no margin for error or missed approaches. "Crimson 6, Peterson Tower. You're first in sequence due to fuel critical. Descend to 1,500 feet. Reduce speed to 160 knots. Configure for straight-in approach runway 35. Tower, Crimson 6. Descending to 1,500, reducing speed. Be advised my number 2 engine is producing approximately 60% power. I may need assistance with go-around procedures if the approach becomes unstable. Crimson 6, negative on go-around planning. You're committed to this approach. Maintain current heading and altitude until 3 miles from threshold, then begin final descent. Emergency equipment is positioned and ready." Rodriguez watched in fascination as Eleanor managed the complex sequencing. Her radio communications were crisp and professional, but more importantly, she was thinking several steps ahead of each aircraft's current position. She was already planning the approach sequence for Crimson 3 while guiding Crimson 6 through his final descent. "Crimson 3, Tower, you're second in sequence. Maintain 2,000 feet, heading 120 degrees. You'll begin your approach when Crimson 6 touches down. Confirm fuel status. Tower, Crimson 3. Fuel showing 4 minutes remaining. That might be optimistic given our current power settings." Eleanor made rapid calculations based on approach speeds, runway occupancy time, and fuel consumption rates. Crimson 3 was cutting it dangerously close. But if Crimson 6 could execute a smooth landing and clear the runway quickly, there would be just enough time. "Crimson 3, reduce power to minimum sustainable settings. You're going to execute a modified power-off approach starting at 1 mile final. This will conserve fuel and give you adequate glide distance to the runway. Tower, I'm not familiar with power-off approach procedures in an F-18. Crimson 3, I am. Follow my instructions exactly, and you'll be fine. The aircraft will perform the approach, you just need to fly it properly. Meanwhile, the radar showed Crimson 7, continuing his erratic approach pattern. Without radio communication, the pilot had no way of knowing about the coordinated landing sequence. He was flying toward the airfield on his own initiative, potentially interfering with the carefully timed approaches of the other aircraft. Eleanor studied the radar track and made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone unfamiliar with advanced aviation procedures. Rodriguez, I need you to activate the emergency lighting system on runway 17. Rodriguez looked confused. But all the aircraft are approaching runway 35. Exactly. Crimson 7 can't hear our radio transmissions, but he can see runway lights. By illuminating runway 17, we'll signal him to use the crosswind runway instead of interfering with our main approach sequence. Will he understand that signal? Any competent pilot will recognize emergency lighting as a directive to use that specific runway. It's basic aviation communication when radios fail. Rodriguez activated the lighting system for runway 17, and within minutes they could see Crimson 7's radar track beginning to turn toward the crosswind runway. The maneuver separated him from the main approach traffic and gave him an unobstructed path to landing. Crimson 6 Tower, you're 2 miles from touchdown. Landing gear and flaps as needed. Emergency equipment is standing by, but your approach profile looks stable. Tower, Crimson 6, gear down, flaps set. I can see the runway lights. Approach feels good despite the engine problem. Eleanor monitored the aircraft's progress on radar while simultaneously coordinating with ground emergency services. Fire. Trucks were positioned near the runway threshold. Medical personnel were on standby, and crash recovery equipment was ready to clear any disabled aircraft quickly. Crimson 6 Tower, looking good. Maintain current approach profile. You're cleared. To land runway 35, the radio was quiet for nearly a minute as Crimson 6 completed his approach. Then, Tower, Crimson 6, aircraft is on the ground and rolling out. No assistance required. Exiting at taxiway Charlie. Rodriguez let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but Eleanor was already focused on the next aircraft. Crimson 3 Tower, you're cleared for approach. Descend to 1,200 feet. Maintain 150 knots until 1 mile final. Then reduce power to idle and configure for power-off landing. Tower, Crimson 3, beginning descent to 1,200. Request confirmation on power-off procedures. Crimson 3, at 1 mile final, reduce throttles to idle, deploy landing gear and flaps, maintain 130 knots glide speed. You'll have a steeper descent angle than normal, but the runway is adequate for rollout. Do not attempt to arrest the descent with power fly the aircraft to the ground and use aerodynamic braking. Roger Tower, power off approach at 1 mile final. While Crimson 3 began his unusual approach procedure, Eleanor was already planning the sequence for the remaining aircraft. Crimson 5 had electrical problems that could worsen at any moment, making him the next priority despite having more fuel than some of the other aircraft. Crimson 5 Tower, report current electrical status. Tower, Crimson 5, I've lost my primary flight management system and navigation displays. I'm flying on backup instruments and manual flight controls. I can maintain controlled flight, but I don't have electronic landing aids. Crimson 5, I'm going to talk you through a manual approach using basic instruments. Reduce altitude to 1,800 feet, heading 110 degrees. When I tell you to turn final, you'll be lined up with the runway centerline. This was the kind of precision flying that required extraordinary skill from both the pilot and the controller. Without electronic aids, the approach would have to be flown entirely by reference to basic instruments and verbal guidance from the tower. It was a technique that few modern pilots had ever practiced, but Eleanor had performed similar procedures dozens of times during her military career. Crimson 3, Tower, you're on final approach. Throttles to idle, configure for landing. Tower. Crimson 3, throttles idle, gear down, full flaps. I can see the runway. This feels really different from a normal approach. Crimson 3, that's exactly right. The aircraft wants to fly the approach, just guide it to the runway. Don't fight the descent rate. The power-off approach was working perfectly. Without the drag of engine power, the F-18 was descending. At a steeper angle but using minimal fuel. The pilot was discovering that the aircraft's aerodynamic design made it capable of sustained gliding flight when properly configured. Tower, Crimson 3, aircraft on the ground, successful landing. That was actually smoother than I expected. 2 down, 4 to go. ELLENO turned her attention to Crimson 7, who was approaching the crosswind runway without radio communication. She could see from his radar track that he was lined up properly and maintaining a stable approach profile, but there was no way to coordinate his landing with ground emergency services or provide assistance if problems developed. Rodriguez, alert the emergency crews that Crimson 7 will be landing on runway 17 without radio contact. They should position equipment, but stay clear of the runway area until the aircraft is stopped. Meanwhile, Crimson 5 was beginning his manual approach using only basic flight instruments. This was perhaps the most challenging task of the entire emergency, requiring precise verbal guidance and exceptional flying skill from the pilot. Crimson 5 Tower, turn left heading 035 degrees. Begin descent to 1,200 feet. You're 4 miles from the runway threshold. Tower, Crimson 5, left turn 035, descending to 1,200. My altimeter is showing some fluctuation. I think the static system may be partially blocked. A compromised altimeter during a manual approach was extremely dangerous. The pilot would have difficulty maintaining proper altitude and descent rate without accurate instrument readings. Eleanor would have to provide more detailed guidance to compensate for the faulty instrument. Crimson 5, disregard your altimeter. I'll provide altitude guidance based on radar. Maintain current descent rate. Turn left heading 025 degrees. You're tracking slightly right of centerline. Tower, this is getting difficult. I'm having trouble maintaining heading without the electronic displays. Crimson 5, you're doing fine. Trust your basic instruments and follow my guidance. Turn right heading 030 degrees. Maintain current descent rate. You're 2 miles from touchdown. The radar showed Crimson 7 touching down on the crosswind runway. Without radio communication, there was no confirmation of his condition, but the aircraft appeared to be rolling out normally and didn't seem to require emergency assistance. Crimson 5 Tower, turn right heading 035 degrees, begin final descent. Landing gear and flaps as needed. You're lined up with the runway centerline, 1 mile from touchdown. Tower, Crimson 5, gear down, flaps set. I can see the runway. Approach lights. This is going to be close. The manual approach was requiring intense concentration from both the pilot and Eleanor. Every instruction had to be precise, and there was no room for error. The pilot was flying purely on instrument references and verbal guidance, a skill that tested the limits of aviation proficiency. Crimson 5 Tower, you're on a glide path, maintaining the current approach profile. Clear to land runway 35. Tower. Crimson 5, I have the runway in sight, completing landing. 3 successful landings. 3 aircraft remain. Eleanor quickly assessed the status of Crimson Leader, Crimson 8, and the unknown condition of Crimson 7 on the crosswind runway. The fuel situation was becoming less critical for the remaining aircraft, but the weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate. Crimson Leader Tower, status report on fuel and mechanical condition. Tower, Crimson Leader. Showing 6 minutes fuel remaining. All systems operational. Ready for approach sequence. Crimson 8, Tower. Report status. Tower, Crimson 8. 10 minutes fuel. All systems green. Standing by for approach. The remaining aircraft were in better condition than the earlier arrivals, but the weather was presenting new challenges. Wind speeds had increased, and precipitation was reducing visibility on the runway. The approaches would need to be flown with greater precision to account for the deteriorating conditions. Crimson Leader, you're next in sequence. Descend to 1,500 feet, heading 140 degrees for southeast approach. Be advised the wind is now gusting to 40 knots with variable direction. Tower, Crimson Leader. Descending to 1,500, heading 140. Request guidance on wind conditions for approach. Crimson Leader, winds are variable but generally from the southwest. Expect a crosswind component of 20 to 30 knots during final approach. Configure for maximum controllability and be prepared for wind shear in the lower altitudes. This was the kind of challenging approach that separated experienced pilots from novices. Landing a high-performance fighter aircraft in strong crosswinds required precise control inputs and the ability to make constant corrections throughout the approach phase. Tower, Crimson Leader, beginning final approach. Winds are definitely gusty down here. Crimson Leader, maintain centerline control with rudder inputs. Don't overcorrect for wind drift, small inputs, constant adjustments. Eleanor watched the radar as Crimson Leader fought through the turbulent air toward the runway. His ground track showed the constant corrections needed to maintain proper alignment, but his approach profile remained stable. Crimson Leader Tower. You're tracking centerline. Clear to land runway 35. Tower, Crimson Leader. Aircraft on the ground. That was a challenging approach, but we're down safely. 1 aircraft remaining. Crimson 8 Tower. You're the final aircraft in sequence. Weather conditions are deteriorating, but you have adequate fuel for a normal approach. Descend to 1,500 feet, heading 140 degrees. Tower, Crimson 8, descending to 1,500, heading 140. I've been watching the other approaches, and it looks like the weather is getting worse. Crimson 8, confirmed. Wind conditions are at the upper limits for safe operations, but you're cleared for approach. Take your time and fly a stable approach profile. As Crimson 8 began his final approach, Eleanor reflected on what had been accomplished in the past hour. 7 F-18 Super Hornets had been safely landed under emergency conditions that would have challenged the most experienced air traffic controllers. Multiple mechanical failures, fuel emergencies, and deteriorating weather had created a situation that exceeded standard operating procedures, but innovative thinking and exceptional skill had overcome each obstacle. Tower, Crimson 8, final approach, requesting landing clearance. Crimson 8, clear to land runway 35. Emergency equipment is standing by. The last F-18 touched down safely and rolled out to the taxiway. The emergency was over. Rodriguez stared at Eleanor with a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. That was incredible. I've never seen anything like that. Eleanor set down the microphone and stepped back from the control console. For the first time in 11 years, she had been back in her element, doing what she was born to do. The satisfaction of successfully completing a complex aviation operation was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that her secret was now exposed. "We need to talk," Rodriguez said. "Who are you really?" Before Eleanor could answer, the telephone rang. It was the base commander who had been monitoring the emergency from his office. The conversation that followed would change everything for both Eleanor and Peterson Air Force Base, but that revelation would have to wait. Right now, 8 pilots were safe on the ground, and that was all that mattered. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the relative quiet of the control tower like a blade. Rodriguez hesitated before answering, knowing that whatever conversation awaited would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the night's events. Eleanor stood motionless beside the radar console, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of coordinating 8 emergency landings under impossible conditions. Peterson Tower, Senior Airman Rodriguez speaking. Rodriguez, this is Colonel Margaret Hawthorne, Base Commander. I've been monitoring your frequency for the past 40 minutes. I need an immediate explanation of what just occurred in my airspace. Rodriguez glanced at Eleanor, uncertainty written across his face. Ma'am, we successfully landed 8 F-18s under emergency conditions. All aircraft are on the ground safely with no injuries. I'm aware of the outcome, Airman. What I want to know is who was providing air traffic control services during the final 30 minutes of that operation. The voice on the radio was not yours, and the procedures being used were not standard Air Force protocols. The moment of truth had arrived. Rodriguez looked at Eleanor, who nodded silently, giving him permission to reveal what had transpired. Ma'am, I received assistance from civilian personnel during the emergency. The individual has extensive aviation experience and provided crucial guidance during the crisis. Civilian personnel? Rodriguez, are you telling me that you allowed an unauthorized person to take control of air traffic operations at a United States Air Force installation? Yes, ma'am. Under the circumstances, it was the right decision. Without that assistance, we might have lost aircraft and pilots. The line was silent for several long seconds. When Colonel Hawthorne spoke again, her voice was measured and controlled. Both of you will report to my office immediately. Do not discuss this incident with anyone else until further notice. Rodriguez hung up the phone and turned to Eleanor. We're in serious trouble. Eleanor picked up her cleaning cart, the mundane reality of her official position starkly contrasting with the extraordinary events of the past hour. Maybe you are. I'm just a janitor who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stop, Rodriguez said firmly. I don't know who you really are, but what happened tonight was not the work of a janitor. You displayed knowledge and skills that would be exceptional even for a senior air traffic controller. Those procedures you used power-off approaches, manual navigation guidance, emergency lighting protocols. I've never seen anything like it. Eleanor began pushing her cart toward the elevator, but Rodriguez blocked her path. Before we face the colonel, I need to understand what I'm walking into. Who are you? She looked at him for a long moment, weighing the consequences of revelation against the reality that her secret was already exposed. The young airman had trusted her with the lives of 8 pilots, and he deserved an explanation. My name is Eleanor Blackwood now, but 23 years ago I was Captain Ellen Mitchell, United States Air Force. I graduated from the academy in 1998, accumulated over 3,000 flight hours in fighter and transport aircraft, and held certifications in advanced flight operations that most pilots never achieve. Rodriguez's eyes widened. You're a former Air Force pilot? What happened? Why are you working as a janitor? It's a long story, and we don't have time for all the details. The short version is that I made a decision during a training exercise that saved lives, but violated military regulations. I was given an honorable discharge, but my flying career was over. The aviation industry didn't want to hire someone with a disciplinary record, regardless of the circumstances. So you've been here for 11 years, listening to radio traffic, watching operations, maintaining your knowledge... Staying connected to the only world I ever really belonged to, Eleanor finished. I kept my pilot's license current, studied every new aircraft manual and procedure update, practiced emergency scenarios on flight simulators. I never stopped being a pilot. I just stopped flying for the military. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. And tonight, when we needed expertise that exceeded standard procedures, you were right there. Tonight was an anomaly. 8 aircraft in simultaneous emergency with deteriorating weather conditions. That's a scenario that could overwhelm even the most experienced controllers. You did everything right according to your training, but some situations require unconventional solutions. The elevator doors opened, revealing 2 security forces personnel in full uniform. "Ma'am, sir, Colonel Hawthorne is waiting. Please come with us." The ride to the base commander's office was conducted in silence. Eleanor found herself reflecting on the irony of the situation. For over a decade, she had successfully maintained her anonymity, content to remain invisible while staying connected to aviation. Now, in the space of an hour, she had revealed capabilities that would inevitably lead to scrutiny, investigation, and potentially serious consequences for both herself and Rodriguez. Colonel Hawthorne's office was exactly what Eleanor expected from a senior Air Force commander. Walls lined with military citations, photographs of aircraft in operations, and the unmistakable aura of authority that came from years of leadership responsibility. The colonel herself was a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Sit down, both of you," Colonel Hawthorne commanded. "Rodriguez, I want a complete chronological account of tonight's events, starting from the initial emergency call." Rodriguez provided a detailed summary of the squadron's emergency, the escalating mechanical failures, the weather deterioration, and his growing realization that the situation was exceeding his capabilities. He described Eleanor's initial observations, her technical knowledge, and the decision to allow her to take control of air traffic operations. Colonel Hawthorne listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Rodriguez finished his account, she turned her attention to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, is that your legal name?" "Yes, ma'am. I changed it after my discharge from the Air Force." "What was your military designation and service record?" Eleanor provided her complete military history, including her academy graduation, flight training, aircraft certifications, and the incident that led to her discharge. She spoke matter-of-factly, without emotion or defensiveness, simply stating the facts of her career and its conclusion. "The incident with Lieutenant Chen over Nevada," Colonel Hawthorne said. "I'm familiar with that case. It was studied extensively at the Fun Academy as an example of exceptional flying skill combined with questionable judgment regarding military regulations." "Yes, ma'am. I'm aware of how it's been characterized." "What's your assessment of your actions that day?" Eleanor considered her response carefully. "My assessment is that I made the only decision I could live with. Standard protocol would have resulted in a pilotless fighter impacting a residential area with unknown casualties. I chose to violate regulations to prevent that outcome. And the consequences of that choice? I lost my military career but kept my integrity. I saved lives but paid the price for breaking rules. I have no regrets about the decision itself, only about the fact that it ended my ability to serve." Colonel Hawthorne leaned back in her chair, studying Eleanor with the analytical gaze of someone evaluating complex information. "Tonight's events present me with an interesting dilemma. On one hand, you performed unauthorized air traffic control operations at a military installation, which is a serious violation of federal regulations. On the other hand, your actions appear to have prevented a catastrophic loss of aircraft and personnel." Rodriguez spoke up. "Ma'am, with respect, Ms. Blackwood's assistance was crucial to the successful resolution of the emergency. Without her expertise, I'm not confident we could have achieved the same outcome. I understand your perspective, Airman Rodriguez, and your performance tonight reflects well on your judgment under pressure. However, the broader implications of this incident extend far beyond tonight's emergency." Colonel Hawthorne stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where emergency crews were still attending to the landed F-18s. "The investigation into this incident will involve multiple agencies. The Federal Aviation Administration will want to understand how civilian personnel gained access to air traffic control operations. The Air Force Inspector General will review the breach of security protocols. Congressional oversight committees may demand explanations. She turned back to face them. Ms. Blackwood, your aviation expertise is undeniable, but your presence in the control tower during a classified military operation raises questions that I cannot simply ignore. Eleanor nodded. I understand the position you're in, Colonel. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences result from tonight's actions. What I'm struggling with, Colonel Hawthorne continued, is the waste of exceptional talent that brought us to this point. Your service record, prior to the Nevada incident, was exemplary. Your performance tonight demonstrates capabilities that are rare even among experienced aviation professionals. Yet for over a decade, you've been working as a custodian at a military installation. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand where you're going with this. Colonel Hawthorne returned to her desk and opened a folder that had been waiting there. What if I told you that tonight's events might represent an opportunity rather than a crisis? Rodriguez and Eleanor exchanged confused glances. This was not the direction either of them had expected the conversation to take. The Air Force has been struggling with a shortage of experienced air traffic controllers and aviation operations specialists. Budget constraints have limited our ability to recruit and train personnel with advanced capabilities. Meanwhile, we have a former Air Force pilot with exceptional skills working as a janitor on our facility. Colonel Hawthorne pulled out several documents from the folder. I've been reviewing your complete service record, including classified assessments that were not part of your discharge proceedings. Your flying evaluations consistently rated you in the top 5% of all Air Force pilots. Your decision-making under pressure, your technical knowledge, and your leadership capabilities were all rated as exceptional. Ma'am, I appreciate the review, but my military career ended over 20 years ago. Your military career ended, but your aviation expertise clearly did not. Tonight proved that you've maintained and even enhanced your capabilities despite being out of active service. Colonel Hawthorne opened another folder. 6 months ago, the Department of Defense initiated a new program designed to recruit experienced aviation professionals for specialized civilian contractor positions. The program is specifically intended to utilize expertise that might otherwise be lost due to traditional military career limitations. She handed Eleanor a document marked confidential. This is a position description for a senior aviation operations specialist. The role involves emergency response coordination, advanced air traffic procedures, and training development for complex scenarios. The position requires exactly the kind of experience and judgment you demonstrated tonight. Eleanor scanned the document, her eyes widening as she read the technical requirements and responsibilities. This is essentially a civilian version of military aviation operations management. Exactly. And the compensation reflects the specialized nature of the position. Approximately 4 times your current custodial salary, with full federal benefits and security clearance restoration. Rodriguez looked stunned. Ma'am, are you offering Ms. Blackwood a job? I'm offering her the opportunity to use her skills in service of her country again, in a role that recognizes her expertise without the constraints that ended her military career. Eleanor set the document down, her mind racing through the implications. Colonel, what about tonight's incident? The unauthorized control of military aircraft, the security violations. Tonight's incident will be characterized as an emergency response action taken by qualified personnel under extraordinary circumstances. Rodriguez will be commended for recognizing when additional expertise was needed and taking appropriate action to ensure mission success. You will be officially designated as having provided emergency consultation services. And the investigation you mentioned will conclude that proper procedures were followed given the exceptional nature of the emergency. The fact that you will be officially hired into an authorized position retroactively legitimizes your actions. Colonel Hawthorne leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. Ms. Blackwood, the Air Force made a mistake 23 years ago. We prioritized regulatory compliance over practical judgment, and we lost an exceptional officer as a result. Tonight gives us the opportunity to correct that mistake. Elena looked at Rodriguez, who was grinning broadly, then back at Colonel Hawthorne. What exactly would this position entail? You would be stationed here at Peterson, working with our air traffic control operations, emergency response teams, and pilot training programs. You would develop procedures for complex emergency scenarios, provide advanced training to controllers and pilots, and serve as our subject matter expert for situations that exceed standard protocols. And if another emergency like tonight occurs, you would be the person we call to coordinate the response. For the first time in over 20 years, Elena felt the stirring of genuine hope. The possibility of returning to meaningful aviation work, of using her skills in service of something larger than herself, was almost overwhelming. There's one condition, Colonel Hawthorne added. This program requires a comprehensive background investigation and psychological evaluation. Your previous service record will be reviewed, including the Nevada incident. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Elena thought about the decision she had made over Nevada, the choice to save lives regardless of regulations, and the consequences she had accepted. Colonel, I've been living with the consequences of my decisions for over 20 years. I have nothing to hide. Then we have an opportunity to turn tonight's crisis into tomorrow's solution, Rodriguez spoke up. Ma'am, what about the other personnel who were involved in tonight's operations? The rescue teams, the emergency responders? They will all be recognized for their professionalism and dedication. Tonight was a team effort that saved 8 lives and prevented the loss of valuable military assets. Colonel Hawthorne stood, indicating that the meeting was concluding. Ms. Blackwood, I'll need your answer within 48 hours. The paperwork for this position will take several weeks to process, but I want to begin immediately if you're interested. Elena rose from her chair, feeling as though she was stepping across a threshold that would change the entire trajectory of her life. Colonel, I don't need 48 hours. If the Air Force is willing to give me another chance to serve, then my answer is yes. Outstanding. Report to personnel at 0800 hours tomorrow morning to begin the application process. Rodriguez, excellent work tonight. Your judgment and professionalism under pressure reflect well on your training and character. As they prepared to leave, Colonel Hawthorne called out one final time. Ms. Blackwood, welcome back to aviation operations. Walking out of the building into the pre-dawn darkness, Elena felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for over 2 decades. The janitor who had spent 11 years in the shadows was about to become a recognized aviation professional again. Rodriguez walked beside her, shaking his head in amazement. When I started my shift tonight, I never imagined it would end like this. Sometimes the most important moments of our lives come disguised as ordinary nights, Elena replied. The key is being ready when they arrive. Above them, the storm was beginning to clear, and the first hints of dawn were appearing on the eastern horizon. 8 F-18 Super Hornets sat safely on the tarmac, their pilots preparing to return home to their families. And for the first time in over 20 years, Captain Elena Mitchell was about to return home to the sky. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly constructed Aviation Operations Center at Peterson Air Force Base. Elena Mitchell, she had legally reclaimed her original name, stood before a room filled with air traffic controllers, pilots, and emergency response personnel from across the Rocky Mountain region. Today marked the implementation of the Emergency Aviation Response Protocol, a comprehensive training program developed from the lessons learned during that stormy night in March. The fundamental principle behind advanced emergency coordination, Elena addressed the assembled group, is that extraordinary situations require extraordinary solutions. Standard operating procedures provide the foundation, but they cannot anticipate every possible combination of factors that might converge during a crisis. Major David Chun, one of the F-18 pilots who had been part of Crimson Squadron that night, raised his hand. Ms. Mitchell, can you walk us through the decision-making process you used to sequence our landings? The fuel calculations alone seemed impossibly complex. Elena moved to the large display screen, showing a three-dimensional representation of airspace management. The key was treating the emergency as a dynamic puzzle rather than a static problem. Each aircraft had different limitations, fuel levels, mechanical problems, pilot capabilities, but those limitations were changing in real time. Instead of applying fixed solutions, we had to continuously adapt our approach based on evolving conditions. She highlighted different sections of the airspace diagram. Crimson 2 was fuel critical, so he required immediate priority. But Crimson 6 had engine problems that made normal approach procedures dangerous. Rather than force him into a standard approach pattern, we developed a power-off gliding technique that addressed both his mechanical limitations and fuel conservation needs. Lieutenant Sarah Bradley, one of the newer air traffic controllers, looked puzzled. But those procedures aren't in any of our manuals. How did you know they would work? Experience and theoretical knowledge, Elena replied. During my military career, I flew test flights for various emergency procedures. The power-off approach technique was developed for situations where engine failure occurred during critical phases of flight. Most pilots never practice it because it's considered too risky for routine training. She pulled up video footage from that night, showing radar tracks of the multiple aircraft approaches. But when you're dealing with a genuine emergency, risky becomes relative. The risk of attempting an unconventional procedure had to be weighed against the certainty of aircraft loss if we followed standard protocols. Colonel Hawthorne entered the training room, accompanied by a man in civilian attire wearing a badge identifying him as FAA Regional Administrator James Patterson. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some special visitors today. Administrator Patterson stepped forward. I'm here to formally announce that the emergency aviation response protocol developed here at Peterson Air Force Base is being adopted as a national standard for military and civilian aviation facilities. The procedures demonstrated 6 months ago have been validated through extensive simulation and field testing. The room erupted in applause. Elena felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that the techniques used to save Crimson Squadron would now be available to aviation professionals across the country. Additionally, Patterson continued, I'm pleased to announce that Ms. Mitchell has been selected to lead the Federal Aviation Administration's new Advanced Emergency Procedures Task Force. This position will involve developing training standards and response protocols for complex aviation emergencies at facilities nationwide. Rodriguez, who had been promoted to Staff Sergeant and was now Elena's deputy in the Emergency Response Division, grinned broadly. Does this mean you'll be leaving Peterson? Not exactly, Elena replied. The position is based here, but it involves travel to training facilities across the country. Peterson will serve as the headquarters for advanced emergency response training and will be hosting personnel from civilian and military aviation operations. Major Chun spoke up again. Miss Mitchell, I have to ask, do you ever miss flying? I mean actually piloting aircraft rather than coordinating operations from the ground? Elena paused, considering the question that had been asked in various forms many times over the past months. 6 months ago, I would have said that flying was the only thing I truly missed about my old life. But coordinating that emergency response taught me something important about the nature of aviation. She walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where F-18s were conducting routine training operations. Flying is about individual mastery, the relationship between pilot and aircraft. But aviation is about systems thinking, understanding how aircraft, pilots, weather, technology, and human decision-making interact to create safe operations. The night we brought Crimson Squadron home, I wasn't just applying flying skills. I was using everything I had learned about aviation as a complete system. That kind of comprehensive understanding is actually more valuable than individual piloting ability. Administrator Patterson nodded approvingly. That perspective is exactly why this program has been so successful. Traditional emergency response training focuses on isolated procedures. This approach treats emergencies as complex systems requiring adaptive solutions. Colonel Hawthorne addressed the group. I want to share some information that demonstrates the broader impact of what we've accomplished here. Since implementing these procedures, Peterson Air Force Base has successfully managed 12 emergency situations that exceeded standard protocols. Other facilities using these techniques have reported similar improvements in emergency response outcomes. She pulled up a statistical display. More importantly, we've identified and prevented several potential disasters by recognizing early warning signs that previous procedures might have missed. The emphasis on continuous assessment and adaptive response has fundamentally changed how we approach aviation safety. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand. Ma'am, what's the most significant change in how controllers approach their duties since the new procedures were implemented? Confidence, Eleanor answered immediately. Controllers now understand that they have options beyond standard procedures when facing extraordinary circumstances. They're trained to recognize when situations exceed normal protocols and how to adapt their response accordingly. She returned to the display screen showing emergency response flowcharts. The old model assumed that following procedures correctly would always produce successful outcomes. The new model recognizes that some situations require innovative thinking within a framework of safety principles. Major Chun looked thoughtful. It's similar to the difference between flying by checklist and flying by understanding aircraft systems. Both are important, but systems knowledge gives you options when the checklist doesn't cover your specific situation. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. Emergency response is about problem solving under pressure, not just following predetermined steps. Administrator Patterson consulted his notes. I want to address something that's been discussed in aviation circles since the Crimson Squadron incident. There's been debate about whether civilian personnel should be authorized to take control of military air traffic operations during emergencies. The room grew quiet, as this question touched on the regulatory and jurisdictional issues that had made Eleanor's actions controversial in some quarters. After extensive review and legal analysis, Patterson continued, the FAA and Department of Defense have established new guidelines for emergency authority delegation. Qualified personnel, regardless of their current employment status, can be authorized to provide emergency assistance when their expertise exceeds that of available certified controllers. Colonel Hawthorne added, this means that exceptional knowledge and experience will not be wasted during critical situations due to bureaucratic restrictions. Obviously, proper authorization and verification procedures must be followed, but emergency situations will be managed by the most qualified personnel available. Lieutenant Bradley asked, how do we identify who qualifies as exceptional during an emergency? Training and certification, Eleanor replied. The new program includes advanced certification levels that go beyond standard air traffic control qualifications. Personnel with extensive aviation backgrounds, including former pilots, can obtain emergency response certifications that authorize them to assist during complex situations. She pointed to a training schedule on the wall. We're already conducting certification courses for experienced aviation professionals who work in non-controller positions. Mechanics, operations specialists, former military pilots, even retired airline captains can now be officially recognized as emergency response resources. Rodriguez looked amazed. So the system is designed to utilize all available expertise during emergencies, not just the people who happen to be on duty? Precisely. Aviation safety is too important to be limited by arbitrary job classifications. Administrator Patterson checked his watch. I want to conclude with some information about the long-term impact of this program. The techniques developed here are being incorporated into civilian air traffic control training nationwide. Commercial airports, regional facilities, and international aviation organizations have all requested training in these procedures. He handed Eleanor a formal document. This is authorization to establish the International Emergency Aviation Response Institute. Peterson Air Force Base will host training programs for aviation professionals from around the world. Eleanor studied the document, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. This means we'll be training personnel from civilian airports, military facilities, and international aviation organizations? Correct. The procedures that saved 8 F-18s on a stormy night in Colorado are now considered essential knowledge for aviation professionals worldwide. As the meeting concluded, personnel began filing out to return to their various duties. Major Chun approached Eleanor privately. Ms. Mitchell, I never properly thanked you for what you did that night. I was Crimson 5, the aircraft with electrical failures. Your guidance during that manual approach saved my life. Eleanor shook his hand. You saved your own life by trusting the procedures and flying the aircraft properly. I just provided information. It was more than that. You gave me confidence when everything seemed impossible. That's a kind of leadership that can't be taught from textbooks. After Chun departed, Rodriguez joined Eleanor at the window overlooking the flight line. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been in the tower that night? Eleanor considered the question seriously. I think about it often. 8 highly trained pilots in 8 sophisticated aircraft, facing conditions that exceeded normal procedures. Statistically, we probably would have lost at least 2 aircraft, possibly more. She watched as a formation of F-18s conducted practice approaches. But what I think about more is the broader principle. How many other people are working in positions that don't utilize their full capabilities? How much expertise is being wasted because we don't recognize potential when it doesn't fit conventional categories? The custodian who's actually a genius engineer, the mechanic who understands systems better than the designers, the administrator who could revolutionize operations if given the chance. Exactly. That night taught me that extraordinary capability can be found in unexpected places. Our job is to create systems that recognize and utilize that capability when it's needed most. Rodriguez smiled. From janitor to international aviation expert in 6 months. That's quite a career change, Eleanor laughed. I prefer to think of it as finally being recognized for capabilities I always possessed. The knowledge and experience were there all along, it just took the right circumstances to reveal them. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Aviation Operations Center, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 23 years earlier, she had been forced to choose between following regulations and saving lives. Tonight, air traffic controllers and pilots around the world would go to sleep knowing that innovative procedures and adaptive thinking had become official parts of aviation. Safety protocols. The janitor who had spent 11 years listening in. The shadows had become the architect of a new approach to aviation emergency response. Sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the greatest victories emerge from apparent defeats. Above Peterson Air Force Base, aircraft continued their eternal dance between earth and sky, guided by procedures that had been born from one extraordinary night when rules proved inadequate and human judgment saved the day. 3 years after that storm-swept night at Peterson Air Force Base, Eleanor Mitchell stood before the United Nations Aviation Council in Geneva, Switzerland. The assembly hall was filled with aviation officials, pilots, and emergency response coordinators from 57 nations. Today marked the formal adoption of the International Emergency Aviation Response Standards Protocols that had originated from 8 desperate F-18s fighting through a Colorado thunderstorm. Excellence in aviation safety, Eleanor addressed. The distinguished assembly is not achieved through rigid adherence to predetermined procedures, but through the intelligent application of expertise when circumstances demand innovation. The Secretary General of the International Civil Aviation Organization, Dr. Maria Santos, had invited Eleanor to present the concluding address for the 3-day conference. Ms. Mitchell's work has fundamentally transformed how we approach aviation. Emergencies worldwide. The protocols developed at Peterson Air Force Base have now been implemented by aviation authorities on every continent. In the audience, Rodriguez, now a Master Sergeant and Director of Emergency Operations at Peterson, watched with pride as his former colleague addressed world leaders. Beside him sat Major Chun, who had become one of the Air Force's leading instructors in advanced emergency procedures. The night that changed everything began with a simple premise, Eleanor continued. When standard procedures prove inadequate, human expertise must bridge the gap between regulation and reality. The challenge is ensuring that expertise is recognized and utilized regardless of where it resides within an organization. She gestured to a large display showing global aviation statistics. Since implementing adaptive emergency response protocols, participating nations have reported a 47% reduction in aircraft losses during complex emergency situations. More significantly, we've prevented an estimated 312 potential disasters by identifying dangerous conditions before they reached crisis levels. Dr. Santos nodded approvingly. These improvements represent more than statistical achievements. They represent lives saved and families spared the trauma of aviation disasters. Following her presentation, Eleanor joined a smaller group for the signing ceremony of the International Aviation Emergency Response Accord. Representatives from major aviation powers, the United States, European Union, China, Japan, Russia, and Brazil formally committed to implementing the new standards within their national aviation systems. As she watched the signatures being applied to the historic document, Eleanor reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she had been invisible, a custodian whose expertise was unknown and unrecognized. Today, aviation professionals worldwide studied procedures that bore her name. After the ceremony, Dr. Santos approached her privately. "Miss Mitchell, I have a proposition that might interest you. The ICAO is establishing a new Global Aviation Emergency Response Center. We're looking for someone to serve as the founding director, someone with both practical experience and the vision to coordinate international emergency response capabilities." Eleanor considered the offer carefully. What would this position entail? Coordinating emergency response resources across national boundaries, developing protocols for international aviation crises, and establishing rapid response teams that could be deployed anywhere in the world within hours. Essentially, creating a global network of aviation emergency expertise. It sounds like an enormous responsibility. It is, but consider the alternative aviation emergencies that could benefit from international coordination, but lack the mechanisms to access expertise beyond national boundaries. A crisis in Southeast Asia could benefit from specialists in North America, or vice versa. This center would make that coordination possible. That evening, Eleanor video-called Rodriguez and Colonel Hawthorne from her hotel room in Geneva. The time difference meant it was afternoon at Peterson, and she could see F-18s conducting training operations through the window behind Rodriguez's desk. "The offer is remarkable," Rodriguez said after she explained the ICAO opportunity. "But it would mean leaving Peterson permanently." "Not necessarily," Eleanor replied. "The center could be based anywhere, and Peterson has the most advanced emergency response training facilities in the world. There's no reason the Global Emergency Response Center couldn't be located in Colorado. Colonel Hawthorne smiled. Actually, there are several compelling reasons why it should be. Peterson's central location in North America, our existing international training programs, and the infrastructure we've already developed would make it an ideal headquarters for global operations. Rodriguez looked intrigued. You mean the center would expand Peterson's role rather than taking you away from it? Exactly. Instead of losing our expertise to international organizations, we would become the focal point for international aviation. Emergency coordination. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the same control tower where she had once cleaned floors and emptied wastebaskets. The space had been completely transformed into the command center for the Global Aviation Emergency Response Center. Multiple displays showed real-time aviation operations across all time zones, with direct communication links to air traffic facilities, military bases, and civilian airports worldwide. Rodriguez, now serving as Deputy Director of the Global Center, monitored incoming reports from aviation facilities around the world. We're receiving a request for consultation from Tokyo International Airport. They're dealing with a complex weather emergency involving multiple aircraft diversions. What's the specific situation? Eleanor asked, settling into the director's chair that had once seemed impossible to imagine occupying. Severe thunderstorms have closed their primary runways, but they have 18 wide-body aircraft inbound with fuel situations that won't permit diversion to alternate airports. Wind conditions are marginal for their secondary runway, and they're requesting guidance on emergency sequencing procedures. Eleanor studied the weather data and aircraft positions transmitted from Tokyo. The situation was remarkably similar to the night that had started her transformation. But now she was coordinating responses across international boundaries rather than managing a single base emergency. Connect me directly to Tokyo Tower, she instructed. We'll walk them through adaptive sequencing procedures based on each aircraft's specific fuel and passenger load situation. As she began coordinating the international emergency response, Eleanor realized that the principles learned during Crimson Squadron's crisis had evolved into something far larger than anyone could have anticipated. The techniques used to save 8 military aircraft on a stormy Colorado night were now being applied to civilian emergencies affecting hundreds of passengers. Master Sergeant Chun, who had joined the Global Center as Chief of Training Operations, approached with an update. Ma'am, we're receiving reports that the Tokyo procedures are working perfectly. All 18 aircraft are being sequenced for safe landings, and the emergency is under control. Outstanding. Make sure we document this response for the training database. International coordination cases like this are exactly what the center was designed to handle. As the Tokyo emergency concluded successfully, Eleanor walked to the window overlooking Peterson's flight line. The view was familiar, but her perspective had changed dramatically. Instead of watching operations as an outsider, she was now coordinating aviation safety efforts that spanned the globe. Her desk phone rang with another international emergency consultation request, this time from a military installation in Australia, dealing with helicopter rescue operations in extreme weather. As she picked up the phone to begin coordinating another life-saving response, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From invisible janitor to International Aviation Authority, her path had been marked by a single principle. Excellence and expertise deserve recognition regardless of their source. The night she stepped out of the shadows to save, Crimson Squadron had demonstrated that extraordinary capability often resides in unexpected places. Now, aviation professionals worldwide understood that emergency response was not about following rigid procedures, but about applying human expertise creatively when circumstances demanded innovation. The protocols that had emerged from one desperate night in Colorado had become the foundation for a new approach to aviation safety that valued adaptability, expertise, and international cooperation. As Peterson Air Force Base settled into evening operations, Eleanor prepared for another night of coordinating global aviation emergency responses. Somewhere in the world, aircraft were encountering difficulties that would require innovative solutions. When those emergencies occurred, the expertise that had once been hidden in a janitor's cart was now instantly available to aviation professionals anywhere on Earth. The transformation was complete. The woman who had spent 11 years listening in the shadows had become the voice that aviation professionals around the world turned to when standard procedures weren't enough. Sometimes the most remarkable journeys begin with the simple decision to step forward when expertise is needed, regardless of whether that expertise is officially recognized. In aviation, as in life, excellence finds a way to emerge, even from the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.